clustered among thorns would be the ideal expression for how my 15-year-old self became snared in an older woman's web of conceit, who was 3 years my senior as she picked the plume of my young virility. Eager to taste the fruit of passion I couldn't fully explore in a previous puppy love relationship with a nice girl who wouldn't give up her goodies, I cut her loose and entered my sophomore year with my budding beard of masculinity. Having ditched my glasses for newly marketed soft contact lenses of the day, a monstrous self-confidence and postulating was unleashed as my first betrothed brought to bear her substantial social skills and aesthetic prowess, not unlike a fashionista Dr. Frankenstein, bringing to fruition her self-realized boy toy, giving the other senior girls something to smack their lips over. My eyes full of stars, and my pants bulging with unexperienced expectation, I was more than ready to jump off a thrilling cliff of infatuation and manly merriment, when my dear concerned mother asked me if I was okay down there. Having found my bloody underwear in the laundry, I was enthusiastically marched in to see my father. With a petulant expression and a sharp vocabulary I inherited from him, I proceeded to make the case that my mother and father had met at 15 and 17 respectively and didn't wait, as my dad whisked away his young love interest to another state, light about his age wherein his future Kentucky back hills, soon to be in-laws, gave their blessing to this lovesick pair to marry at 16 and 18, my father never telling his parents until bringing his bride home. This clever maneuver of verbal gymnastics caught my parents off guard like deer in the headlights and assured them she was my first and would be my last, for I was a one-woman romantic dreamer who beloved in true love. With her baby-face features, she dazzled and delighted my simmering senses with her platinum hair and fine figure, all dolled up in her perfectly filled out her various pastel variety of cashmere sweaters in fashion at the time. With the $80 price tag and a 61-cent a gallon gas era, you can do the math. Who knew the 3-year engagement would be 1 year longer than the ill-conceived marriage? My parents succumbed to exhaustion, trying to convince me to relocate in my junior year. But I got a job, an apartment, assuring them I'd finish high school at night. The wedding had 8 bridesmaids, and my pastor father officiated. We had a red, white, and black classic color combo where the portraits held up better than the brief marriage. My father tried to warn me off this dynamic and seemingly sophisticated prima donna because of her tendency at flamboyant emotionalisms, but I was sure I could be her all in all and somehow satisfy her ferocious appetites, including being able to drink any fella under the table and sing like an operatic aficionado. I was never a drinker, but she was a dazzling package of fragile and complicated femininity, with a deep and mysterious psyche to explore and solve with my enormous ego. I suppose it's imperative we youngsters are stupidly confident in our ignorance of an unforgiving world of woes, or we wouldn't dare charter such dangerous waters. We met on a theatrical stage during high school, acting and singing in summer stock, community theater, and off-Broadway type shows. We soon became the couple of our peer group and settled down to administrative jobs by day and flexed our compatible thespian tendencies because artistic endeavors were our world. Unfortunately, while performing in different shows, she spiced up another co-actor's world, succumbing to her insatiable appetite for attention and sexual escapades that left this clueless PK, preacher's kid, devastated. The marriage bore no children, probably because we were, if anything, satisfied in our self-indulgent lifestyles. The hinge-pin in the complexity of our 5 years together was her loss of 100 pounds gained during our time together, and her falling prey to the notion that such transformation surely solves all your problems. Again, the newly gained illicit attention outside the union left our marital bliss as roadkill to be picked at by emotional vultures ready to pounce at a moment's notice. Therefore, we both ended up in relationships leading nowhere except the last exit on a very unsatisfying and distasteful turnpike. I remember my mother breaking down in tears of relief when I knocked on her door with my girlfriend, after I conveniently forgot to stay in contact with the folks after my divorce. This voluptuous cougar with 2 young sons' certainty was a surprise to them, and my ill-conceived affair with this married woman whom I'd picked up at the bar I was bartending was a far cry from my religious household roots. Although I was one of many dalliances she entertained, my potential as a positive influence to her boys is why she came clean with her traveling husband. After we broke up 3 years later, she approached me in a department store and told me she appreciated how I treated her sons so much better than their own fathers. Alas, not unlike my first girlfriend I dumped before high school, My love interest family would end up being the heartbreaking challenge compared to the significant other. I've connected online with these boys as adult men and am surprised they remember my positive influence beginning at the young ages of 4 and 7. It's one of only a few feathers in my cap I can claim amidst the collateral damage of my sordid personal life. The sharpest memory during these years is the embarrassingly serial-worthy episodes of my hiding out in the boys' toy box as their father unexpectedly arrived home early. After this incident, I decided these kids of heart-stopping escapades certainly weren't worth the stress. Although I was a one-woman man throughout my adult life, I'm not proud of being the proverbial other man and would never recommend this lifestyle. When asked how long I've been married, I usually say I've been married 50 years, off and on. This, of course, raised his eyebrows, and years later, when I was an Uber driver, I would have my little narrative polished. After that statement, I would say, "Do you know what my first wife's name is?" They shake their head, and I would say, "Diane Marie." "Do you know what my girlfriend after my first wife's name is?" As I shake my head up and down, "Diane Marie." And then I would say, "And do you know what my second wife's name is?" And they would say, "No, Diane Marie." Wherein I would say, "Her name is Stephanie," wherein I get a relieved laugh. It wasn't until I told him the name of my third wife, whose name is Diane Marie, that I got a double take that would rub her neck the best of them. My second marriage was my longest at 22 years, and she was definitely the girl my mother would have wanted me to marry. She was demure, considerate, and quiet like her father. Where it all really fell apart eventually was my being pretentious, bold, and downright brazen like her mother and sister. I've spent a lot of time repenting privately and in subsequent conversations with my second wife about how I could have treated her so shabbily, considering my father treated my mother so well as a role model. I've come to understand that God puts measuring rods in your life to influence who you are, innately, and rub the raw edges off at their expense. Unfortunately, I had an older sister who was going to college when I was born. She is 18 years older, so she's more like an auntie. I also have a brother who is 13 years older and has passed, whom I took after in appearance, but not in temperament. He had a personality like my second wife, as did my full-blooded Native American Indian 4-year-old kid sister whom my parents adopted when I was 9. We were a part of the second family, which included my 3 years older 4-year-old brother whom we adopted when I was 1, who is half Japanese and half American and has a similar temperament to my second wife, oldest brother, adopted brother, and my kid sister. So if I've done any changing over the years, I would attribute these very important influences by observation, besides being conformed into the likeness of Christ through a newfound faith at the age of 26. Years into the marriage with my second wife, wherein I got on fire for God and became a lifelong God chaser. I was raised an American Baptist and my second wife was raised Lutheran. Ironically, I became spirit-filled 2 years later, but not from my own curiosity. What I mean by this is my second wife's faith, known as the Frozen Chosen, was interrupted after my born-again experience at the age of 26 by her attending a revival meeting where I was not in attendance because I was at work, by getting physically knocked out of her seat by the power of God. When I came to pick her up after work, she hopped into the car and said she'd never be able to go to a church where she couldn't raise her hands and worship again. I looked at her perplexed. This simple Baptist boy who was in the infancy of understanding a Christian experience, and dutifully said okay. And if we went to what would be considered a charismatic church today, where we subsequently were prayed to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit with evidence of speaking in tongues, which we both did, and it propelled us into a new walk of faith. I had spent a couple years between the age of 26 and 28 trying to figure out how to deal with the hypocrisy of professing my faith and living in sin at the same time. I was a straight shooter and was not interested in pretending to be anything I wasn't. This led me on a years-long journey of God, peeling back my identity in the things of the world, including my relationship with my parents, with my wife, with my boss, my identity as an employee-employer, and my ego being in all the baskets that could shred your identity if things didn't go right, which they often didn't. I have found over the years that it wasn't as much quitting smoking, porn, or materialism that was nearly as hard as giving up attitudes of the heart, like anger, resentment, unforgiveness, doubt, fear, self-consciousness, pride, etc. But little did I know at the time my zealousness was outpacing my second wife by leaps and bounds, and she didn't end up being on board as much as I thought, because my personality was so narcissistic and would not entertain my spouse's opinions and attitudes, especially if they were against my own. After my mother died unexpectedly, we left the state to be with my family, leaving her family behind because my dad needed the TLC after losing his spouse of 62 years. During the previous handful of years, we had moved inside the state, but a few hours away where I got my first job as a radio announcer after having left being the operations manager for the Alzheimer's Association. This is where I felt God was leading me, and it was a difficult choice for my second wife to follow me in that endeavor because she couldn't see the intrinsic value of it. I was excited about this new post but confused that it was in a secular oldies radio station as opposed to the Christian radio station right across the street. Little did I understand at the time that I was nowhere near mature enough to be able to be in an atmosphere where I would do more good than bad for such a post. But God knew, and He owned my skills for 3 years at this little radio station. And upon my mother's death, we proceeded to start a new life further south in a warmer climate. My second wife and I continued to press into performing together in ministry songs I had written. But in my zeal, I intimidated her more than provided a safe and loving environment for us to bond as a couple in ministry. I cut off my nose to spite my face, so to speak. This ended up being a difficult transition for my second wife because she was a city girl, and all of a sudden we were in the country up on a ridge, isolated but involved in a small local church that was a haven of fruits of the Spirit, that is, loving kindness as opposed to God, having educated me in the gifts of the Spirit before we moved south. When my mother was alive, and we were taking care of my parents, we were involved in a small house ministry that was very into experiencing the move of the Holy Spirit in a very personal setting, where God would minister to His people through His people and sharpen their gifts of discernment, healing, and the manifesting presence of God corporately. I learned quickly, but was in need of the other side of the equation, which was learning to love His people, which did not come easily to someone with a sharp nature like mine. They would shoot off his mouth at the drop of a hat and create bad feelings of collateral damage. I have learned subsequently that the emotional stone wall that I put up comes from an unlikely root of losing my boyhood friend at the age of 9 from a car accident where he was there one day and gone the next. This conditioned me not to get attached, and therefore, I would keep people at bay with my bad temperament and my sharp wit, repelling them by not providing a safe and trusting environment for the nurturing of any type of relationship. Even after all these years of God working on me, I still find that I build relationships with women much easier, and that my best friends have always been my wives, and that I have never really been interested in what I would consider shallow topics, but instead more emotional depth, soft conversation about faith and family and topical events, including eschatology. Rooted in my waxing poetic in my days before serious faith, where I would be quite philosophical, which never held the answers, but was very interesting nonetheless. As we worked on our ministry and took care of my widowed father participating in the local church, we did some interim preaching at our church where we were approached as a couple to become ordained in that denomination because of our gifts and talents. I was much more excited about this than my wife because if I were her, I wouldn't want to be in partnership with me at the time, which of course is what I've learned since then. I went through the ordination process, including the educational part, so quickly because I was so pumped up, but my wife was dragging her feet on doing her homework. I didn't hold my frustration back because I knew I always wanted to be in ministry like my dad, even though I never really felt called to be a pastor, but felt with a partner I could succeed. I remember when we interviewed for the board directors of the denomination. The anointing was very heavy, and it couldn't have gone better. But my wife at the time, trying to be honest about her not wanting to be in a fishbowl in ministry, especially with me. I'm sure I pretty much told her to get with the program or quit being a dead weight. Knowing her nature, I, to this day, give her the benefit of the doubt that she left me because she believed that she was getting in the way of my dream. She denies that she left me because of my temperament, which she had been living with for 20 years, or that my dad was living with us, and she felt like her life had been stolen from her because of relocating away from her family. Well, one day I woke up and the clothes in the closet were gone, and I jumped out of bed, jumped in my car, and I was able to actually catch her down at the bottom of the ridge. I jumped in her car and asked her, "What in the world are you doing?" She looked dazed, confused, and the Lord said to me on the spot, and my spirit let her go. I got out of the car. She drove off, and I immediately regretted letting her go. But it was the right thing to do because I needed the wake-up call, and she needed the freedom. I spent the next 9 months courting my wife long distance to get her back. I was so excited when she finally decided that I went up there to help her pack without her permission, whereupon she drove me to the airport and dropped me off. I having no clue that my overbearing personality triggered her. I got on that plane heartbroken in tears. Little did I know that God had seated right next to me on a flight. I should have been able to get last minute, But I did a man who spoke hope into my life and had been through the same thing with his wife, and they were now reunited years later, having navigated this drama in their marriage. I clung on to that hope so tight, and subsequently, she did return on her own, but 3 months after that, instead of running away, she told me that she was leaving again. She paced for about 6 hours that day before she left, and we had gone and seen our pastor, but to no avail. She wasn't interested in my focus of ministry and on my dad, and just didn't believe it would lead to any kind of life that she would want to be a part of. There was also something else that came out during this time, and that is that we had not been able to have children and had tried infertility treatments and even considered adoption, but was frightened away by bitch accounts of older children's inability to bond, especially between the ages of 5 and 10, which is the age range we were looking at the time. During this trial, my grief surfaced about not being able to have children, and my second wife had endometriosis preventing us from conceiving, and I believe this was another motive as to why she left. It was not as devastating the second time she left because I wasn't caught off guard, but I had to let her know that if she left this time, that I don't know that I'd be able to open my heart again, which ended up being prophetic. It was interesting how things in your life will start to fall away before situations erupt. For example, we had a border collie. It was black and white. We just adored. And that dog ran off probably just weeks before my wife left. I remember after she left the second time, her being upset that I had given our 3 cats away because they were getting to be too much for my dad, as I was spending time away courting my next wife in another state and would be gone for a week at a time. Fortunately, my father was able to take care of himself as I pre-prepared everything, and he had his routine and was getting past after a number of years emotionally being devastated by my mother's loss, and he wanted me to be happy again in a new marriage. It is interesting. When my second wife left the second time, my father said to her, "This is something that you will always regret." I always felt bad about that and prayed to reverse the curse of that statement because I wanted her to be able to move on and have a good life. So my dad and I moved back up to a northern state after I courted another Diane Marie. You think I've learned my lesson? Her family was very good to me and understood that she was a challenge, to say the least. Little did I know that the Lord was giving me a dose of my own medicine, so it was a stiff learning curve being married to my third wife, because in many ways she was a lot like me and I could not intimidate her, and ended up being just a fraction of who I was by standing down to a real force of nature. She had only been saved 10 years, so her past was much more recent and her rough edges were really rough. I remember one incident that just absolutely hurt my feelings so bad, when she physically tore down something that I had been working on because it wasn't to her satisfaction, that I immediately understood how I had made my second wife feel for most of her marriage by being overbearing, critical, and legalistic. I spent most of my time being reminded of the pain I had caused in my previous relationship and getting a real dose of humble pie. I had thought that I had growing pains in previous seasons the Lord had led me through, but nothing compared to looking in the mirror of my failures and falling into such a deep depression of despondency that our very large church service was interrupted by our senior pastor laying hands on me as I sat in the sanctuary next to my current wife and have the whole church pray for me. That's how obvious the spirit of oppression was on me. I spent probably 4 years of that 4.5-year marriage praying that God would release me from the torment of living under such an ogre personality. I could certainly dish it out, but I couldn't take it. The bright light during this time was my third wife having her first granddaughter, and my being able to be a part of that from birth through the early form of years. I loved playing grandpa, having never been able to experience my own children. My third wife always joked that I wouldn't leave me, not because of her, but because of her grandbaby. This was a very emotionally and physically abusive relationship. I haven't been raised in a family of faith where my parents honored each other and didn't disrespect each other. This was indeed unfamiliar territory. But when she got so violent that I felt even my elderly father was in danger, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up, I felt released to return to my family in the South. I had realized during the marriage that my third wife, even though she had been divorced for 9 years and was married to an alcoholic, was demonstrating some of the behavior of people who have been married to addicts. She had not processed her marriage and was trying to fit my square peg into her ex-husband's round hole. So this was a rebound relationship on both sides, because I was so hurting when my second wife left that I actually got up and sat in my elderly father's lap in his recliner. I was so devastated. 3 days later, I went to church one evening, and I played one of my songs, and I reported that God had lifted me initially out of my despair, which was a true miracle, and I'm sure it had something to do with my father's fervent prayers. I had always been more of a mama's boy and much closer to my mother. But these times caused me to bond more with my father, who was not an emotional communicator but more of an educator. Personality-wise, I had my father's intellect, but my mother's intuitive emotional nature. My father and I drove all night to get down south, but we had to stop at a hotel because I hadn't realized what an emotional strain that relationship was, and I ended up dry heaving after we got settled in the hotel room because I just couldn't drive. We settled in pretty good at my brother's compound where his in-laws lived, and I bought a camper that I stayed in while my dad stayed in the house. I completely adapted and pitched in and would not allow our presence to be nothing but a blessing, and took complete care of Dad. This was a bonding experience with my family, who had always been there for me in my time of need, especially my older brother, whom I physically resembled. I remember as a little kid him and his big old cowboy hat and cowboy boots, and I was just a little tyke, and he'd have a big belt buckle on, and I looked up to him as he looked like he was a superhero. Strangely enough, even though we were on opposite sides of the temperament scale, many of the foods we liked were the same, and our baby pictures could only be picked out by the fact of his being black and white and mine being color. Otherwise, we looked identical as babies. Even though I had my father to take care of, I was not really interested in putting my life indefinitely on hold, and I went on Christian Mingle and found a gal a few states over that I went over and saw, who was a camp counselor and an awesome soloist like my first wife, and I really felt like we hit it off, had a lot of chemistry, and we have our common love for ministry. She wasn't so sure, so I went through a period of loneliness like I have never felt before. After a number of months, she ended up contacting me back again, and I went over to see her. I drove my camper over, but when I was tuning in the local TV station, I ran across a televangelist named Perry Stone, who was in the middle of a 30-minute teaching. He stopped all of a sudden, completely out of context, looked straight into the camera, and said, "You think she's the right one? Well, she's not." Then he went right back to his teaching as if nothing had happened and apologized at the end of the broadcast of saying somebody needed to hear that cause he didn't know what that was about. But I knew what that was about, because in my spirit, I understood that I needed to go ahead and once and for all in this relationship, which she didn't seem to be bothered by at all, even though she's the one that had contacted me again. Once I met my soon-to-be fourth wife, Barbie, I understood why she wasn't the right one, because Barbie was the right one. We texted and then subsequently spoke on the phone, and I went over and visited her. And then she came and visited me on my birthday to meet my dad, whom she sat and sang hymns with him as they competed on who knew the most obscure one. We had all day and all night conversations with each other, and since her ministry was counseling and I was pretty much an open book, we got close very quickly, and there wasn't anything off limits in our conversations. She had 7 grandchildren and 5 children and 9 sisters and 4 brothers, and I felt completely overwhelmed by her clan. But when I came to see her, I knew that God had sent me, and so I took my father's old wedding ring to give to her as a promise ring. Whereupon she put it on her toe as a toe ring, which I could have taken as an insult and never did have the guts to tell my dad she did that, but I understood that she was all about her feet at that time, so that was a great compliment. She had been in a 30-year marriage where her husband rejected her because of her obesity, and I appreciated heavier women and just my preference physically. I of course have much baggage that I didn't even realize I was carrying until I started to thaw out with a new wife. That was a counselor. In the initial stages of our relationship, Barbie suggested that we counsel each other because I had counseled men in sexual purity. I told her I thought that was the craziest idea and the fastest way to undermine a new relationship, so we decided not to do that, although a good part of our marriage has been about listening and helping each other process our mutual baggage of damaged relationships. The challenge for her was the peer pressure and rejection of marrying a man that has been married 3 times before. If she hadn't been listening to the Lord, she would have never been willing to take that kind of chance. But the Lord had given her many confirmations that he was sending someone. There was one time when she was in worship with me, and the Lord told her during a song about forgiveness that my 3 marriages were forgiven, and that put her at ease. Another thing happened during that service was that she told me that the Lord said if I were to ever have a child, his name would be Samuel. No, I had never told Barbie that my second wife and I had had a prophetic word that our son would be named Samuel. We were so freaked out by this that we actually wore protection on our honeymoon night, because Barbie started menstruating after having been in full-blown menopause for quite a while, so we thought something might be up. I don't know why we weren't open to the possibility, but initially we thought having a child after the age 50 was a little over the top. I did the best I could to ingratiate myself to her family to somehow build a sense of roots after living a life of constantly moving around and pulling up roots. But the reality is, if you're not a part of the clan, you're not very easily adopted into the clan, and you just have to face that disappointment that it can never be the way you had hoped that might be. That was one bright shining light about my third marriage, was that her family was very open about inviting me into being able to be a grandparent, and her parents were really good to me, including her daughter. Again, that was another situation that was not unlike my first girlfriend, whose families were awesome, but if the main thing's not working, it's not enough. Barbie and I faced the challenge of her oldest son getting divorced, and I hate coming onto the scene right at the time when he really needed to be handheld during this devastating time. We had some initial bonding with this, especially the young grandchildren. Barbie have been told by the Lord that she would sell the house she was in, and when my father passed, we went ahead and did that and bought ourselves a motorhome and did some traveling down into Florida, where I was able to actually visit one of my previous female bosses who was a great influence and mentor to me. We had courted for a year, and subsequent to selling the house, knew the Lord wanted us to go through 4 seasons. Unfortunately, waiting that period of time didn't make much difference in family or friends' attitudes about Barbie marrying someone like me. We had certain people that were in our corner from the beginning, who were hearing from the Lord that He provided us support systems, but the vast majority was giving us a pretty hard time, which bonded us together even more and had the opposite effect intended by the critics. After we spent some time in the motorhome, we investigated becoming house parents to live on site every other week and got a position ministering to teenage girls. Then we switched to little girls. Then we switched back to teenage girls by the end of our tenure, which was an opportunity to see how well we really work together as parental authorities. I, of course, was completely out of my element, and Barbie had to do most of the heavy lifting because she was so experienced with not only counseling but children. I oftentimes was physically ill because of the stress, but we see it as an important aspect of feeling like we somehow raised children together. God was able to give me some things I had never experienced before, especially with the little children, and being able to do things with them that they hadn't been able to do, like teach them how to ride bikes or to dance with each one of them in turn as a papa figure. It's the first time I ever had little girls call me Daddy, which was so extremely heartfelt. We got the idea that as parents, we are very coordinated and back to each other up. Barbie's attention to detail and documenting each one of those dozen girls actually caused those girls to be able to be returned to their homes or be adopted, because the red tape, which was stalled out before Barbie started taking care of it, now made it possible for girls to rotate out. I couldn't have been more proud that God could use my wife's counseling and administrative and parenting talents in such an awesome ministry. For me, it was more about self-healing, I think, and for Barbie it was bonding with her husband and being used of by God in that scenario. I remember we would have our weeks off, and all we wanted to do was sleep because the hours were so long when we were working with the girls. So we didn't have much of a life outside that until we decided to sell the camper and move back closer to the grandchildren so we could experience them growing up. One of Barbie's daughters suggested that we become Uber drivers, and I did that many years until I developed cataracts, and Barbie still does that to this day and is very accomplished. One of the things other than emotional healing that I've been able to do while at home is to minister to my wife, not only emotionally for going through her baggage and being a support system for her journey of weight loss, which she has accomplished through surgery and changing our diet, but also being a homebody and beautiful to her needs, as her love language is acts of service, and I enjoy playing a host-servant role, which is one of my gifts I like to give. Both of us enjoy words of edification, which we strive to encourage in each other. We have depth in our conversation and emotional connection, but work through the baggage on a pretty continual basis, fortunately, recognizing what might be from previous relationships and try not to allow that to sabotage our current relationship because of buttons being pushed of ghosts from the past. I had been in one accident a year for 5 years straight and have pretty severe PTSD, which has caused me somewhat of a nervous condition, and as I take my love poetry I've written for Barbie while we recording and turn it into songs using AI, re-listening back to my ministry poetry especially brings healing back around. I've been able to take my radio ministry of PureheartPoints, which are 90-second short feature programs, and produce them into a video format and build a library to minister on an online platform. These 2 outreach of ministry called PureheartPoint Music and Teaching is very satisfying, and I am believing God will use it long after I am gone. One thing that is somewhat unusual that you don't hear about too often is the Lord told me the month and year that he would retrieve me. You hear about people who know before we are going to die when they start giving stuff away and making final arrangements and things like that, but not often do you hear 30 years in advance someone knowing not the day or the hour but the month and year they live to. At first, I was very depressed about the fact of living that long because Lord Jesus is on the tip of my tongue at all times. But now I've reconciled myself to understand that God's going to have his way and that I need to be paying attention more to my diet, which both of us have done so I can stay mobile as long as possible. I give plasma twice a week to supplement my social security, and along with Barbie's social security and her working Uber, we get by. Both of us are going through a metamorphosis of sorts, trying to get past these constant periods of transition that have plagued our marriage, whether it be location, situation, family, dynamics, friendships, or whatever. It all seems to be very fluid. The only thing that hasn't been fluid for me is that I have settled down in one place, and I'm not constantly moving, which has provided me with some objectivity that I don't get the itch once in a while because my plan was somewhat nomadic. I have come to realize after getting my DNA tested that I am not mostly German that my Hammer name would imply, but rather English, Irish mixed European, and even 5% Jewish, which I was delighted by. For my ministry, I have taken on the name of my Uncle Jack, which was my mother's brother, and who wouldn't want the name Jack Hammer? This is for my online ministry, and is a distinction between the Barbie and Ken thing, which has been a joy and delightful, but feel like my identity needs to be somewhat independent, especially since it doesn't appear that ministry, in the conventional sense, will be under the umbrella of a couple, but we will be doing our individual pursuits, which for Barbie is counseling and for me is my online music and teaching ministry. We don't know what the future holds, but we do know who holds the future and continue to try to keep the faith in this ever-changing world that appears to be coming to somewhat of a conclusion, and look forward to having many crowds to throw out the feet of Jesus because we know that everything else will be burned up like stubble. For Barbie, it's always been about relationships, and for me, it's been about trying to use my gifts and talents to reach as many people as possible to bring discipleship in one form or another through the words God has given me prophetically through the years. In conclusion, although my ministry verse is "the pure in heart shall see God," my mantra for life is God's promise that my grace is sufficient for thee.